Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thank you so much for joining us. Hurricane Laura was a reminder this week of the power and the horror that tropical systems can muster. Those who were around for Katrina 15 years ago this weekend did not need to be reminded. We will look back at the storm that broke the levees, including the conditions that caused it, as well as the response by the news media, elected officials, and the police. We'll also examine if we are better protected today. And joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Mark Schleifstein, environmental reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Dave Cohen, news director, WWL Radio, and Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV, Channel 4. Over to E, and what a week it's been in the midst of a pandemic, 2 storms.
Yeah, and the bulk of the show tonight is about Katrina, remembering Katrina, but there's just a couple of stories that we wanted to mention. One is our weekly COVID-19 update, and the governor said this week that the numbers were getting better. But there was no secret that he was going to extend phase 2, which he did. And the key reasons that he gave were, one, because of the people returning to school at the elementary and grade school level, but also college people and new people coming into town. And so that was going to be a whole new population. So he's concerned about that. And then when he was talking about that like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, he may not have been thinking about the other thing that happened, and that, of course, was the hurricane and the displacement of people throughout the state. And especially of all places, Lake Charles, that Lake Charles had one of the highest rates of COVID cases. And all of a sudden, these people were being distributed. And so it became evident really quickly that it was going to be extended, and it has for 2 more weeks. And we'll see about that. And the other story, of course, is Laura. Early in the week, the governor talked about the 1-2 punch when we had Marco and then Laura, one from the right and one from the left. Well, the one from the right never really came very much, but the one from the left certainly did. It became a really strong storm. I got to tell you, Wednesday was really a scary day if you're listening to the coverage. The things that people were predicting could happen and might happen. Ultimately, what happened was really bad. It was a lot of wind damage, but they didn't have the water damage that was anticipated. The last report we had was that there were like 11 deaths in Louisiana and Texas, which is horrible, but by comparison, Katrina had like around 1,500. And so I think you're going to account for a lot of things. And so those are the major stories. But the kind of ominous notices remind me of another story that 15 years ago this weekend, we were starting to be aware of Katrina. And that day before, on August the 28th, the Weather Service put out this announcement, which was just a frightening announcement. And where they were talking about warning people what was going to be happening the next day, that they said a lot of buildings wouldn't survive, a lot of buildings would tumble, a lot of people, if they went outside, they would die. And here you go, devastating damage expected. Hurricane Katrina, a most powerful hurricane with unprecedented strength, rivaling the intensity of Hurricane Camille of 1969. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. So that was 15 years ago tomorrow. The majority of industrial buildings will become non-functional. Partial to complete wall and roof failure is expected. All wood frame low-rising apartment buildings will be destroyed. Concrete block low-rise apartments will sustain major damage, including some wall and roof failure. So people were starting to really get scared. And then when they read more, high-rise office and apartment buildings will sway dangerously. A few at the point of total collapse. All windows will blow out. And if you remember the Hyatt, that's where it really happened there. Airborne debris will be widespread and may include heavy items such as household appliances and even light vehicles. Sport utility vehicles and light trucks will be moved. I remember seeing one truck that was on top of a tree. The blown debris will create additional destruction. Persons, pets, and livestock exposed to the winds will face certain death if struck. Do not venture outside. So that's the word that was coming out during the community. And, this was the first time where there really was a major evacuation order. I mean, there have been hurricanes in the past. People had said you should leave town, but this is the time that the hammer came down heavy, and this was the beginning of the whole Katrina episode.
And that was really...
Remember, when that came out, Katrina was a Category 5 at the time. It was a 3 at landfall, but when they issued that, it was a 5 in the Gulf of Mexico. And if it had come ashore as a 5 with the power they were describing there, all of that probably would have come to fruition, and maybe worse.
Well, then, of course, what happened, we had the failure of the levees and all the flooding. Right. Go ahead, Mike.
And that storm, took that classic jog to the east right as it made landfall. And that, spared us what the Weather Service, worst case scenario was. And, frankly, I was at the eye of Hurricane Andrew in Franklin, Louisiana, St. Mary Parish years earlier. And it was a much more powerful storm, much more wind damage. By comparison, Katrina was, manageable, except for the failure of the federal levees.
Yep, that's right. And, gosh, the community certainly suffered because of that. Mark, let's go over to you. And, we see these dire warnings that were issued in 2005 by the National Weather Service about Katrina. Remind us, how did Katrina get started and what were we expecting just literally less than a day before?
Well, it actually started as one of these tropical waves that came off of the African coast and made its way to basically the Bahamas, became a tropical depression and then a storm, and it hit Miami, cut across the state, went into the lower Gulf of Mexico, and then started picking up speed and intensity, very similar to what happened the last couple of days with Hurricane Laura. It went through rapid intensification as it hit extremely hot water in the Gulf of Mexico, and it reached Category 5 strength, 175 miles an hour, while it was still about a day out. And fortunately, there were two things that happened, one fortunate and the other unfortunate. The fortunate thing was that it did start to lose some of its intensity. The problem was that as it lost its intensity, it expanded to 450 miles across. And so it became this intense system that created all sorts of crazy conditions from one side to the other, literally from Galveston all the way to the Florida Panhandle. And as it went ashore, it went across Buras at 6:10 a.m. in the morning and started its way towards the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And people who live in New Orleans forget, because of the major flooding here, that there was 28 feet of storm surge on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It was probably 15 to 18 feet on the St. Bernard area, and probably 13 feet to 10 feet in Lake Pontchartrain. So you had all those conditions that were occurring. And then, of course, there was the completely unexpected. We all trusted that the levee system would work. After all, it was built by the experts, the Army Corps of Engineers and their contractors. And it turned out that as we learned after the storm, that there were major problems with the construction. In the east, the levees were built improperly so that as soon as they were overtopped by the storm surge, they literally disappeared because of organic material in their middle. And as the water from Lake Pontchartrain moved into the different drainage canals on the western side of New Orleans, the flood walls along those canals failed. On the 17th Street Canal, they literally moved out 32 feet. Because of the weight of the water. It wasn't overtopped. On the London Avenue Canal, the water went through the bottom of the canal and blew its way out on the other side of the canal. And you had flood walls that failed on both sides there.
Hey, Mark,
so there were major problems.
Mark, every year when we do this anniversary show, I do the same thing. I ask you to tell the story about a phone call you got that day. Well, it's a story worth retelling. Would you mind telling us?
Sure. So on about 4 o'clock on Saturday before the storm, I am sitting in the newsroom with the publisher and my editor standing over my desk and my computer as we're discussing where to put a storm surge model map that showed a flooding of the lower Ninth Ward. a Hurricane Betsy disaster. And the argument was, is it really that bad? Are we scaring people for no reason? And the phone rang, and I pick up the phone, and it's Max Mayfield, then director of the National Hurricane Center. And I had arranged for Max to call me earlier in the day, but that's not why he was calling me. It was something else. But the first words that he said were, "Mark, how high is your building, and what kinds of winds can it withstand?" And I turned white, and the argument behind me was over. And he explained that it was a Category 5 hurricane, and it was, the big one that had the potential of storm surge moving all the way from the Gulf of Mexico across into the West Bank and across the Mississippi River and just keep on coming. And then it turned out that the real reason he wanted to get a hold of me was to find out what Mayor Nagin was doing. And so I gave him the number to the governor's mansion, and they talked to the mayor.
Well, we're bringing back these memories, and it's just those really are not good memories. Just like watching that huge storm Laura in the Gulf tonight. I mean, this week rather, seeing that just an enormous storm looking like a buzzsaw, just brings you back to just a really, really horrible time. And it was a time that the media really was called upon to get the information of what was going on to the people. Dave, talk about that.
It was difficult because it was only 15 years ago, but the technological landscape was so different then. We were just talking as we were getting ready to come on the air about how most people had never sent or received a text message before Hurricane Katrina. And there were no text alerts, there were no smartphones, and getting information to people then was far more challenging than it is now. And I recall so vividly the Friday before Katrina, when the forecast track in the 1 p.m. advisory was that it was going to hit the Florida Panhandle. And in fact, I checked out early that day. I said, okay, it's a Florida storm. We've got it covered. We had the personnel ready to go to cover it as a Florida event. And I went to the gym. And speaking of technology, while I'm at the gym, at the 4 o'clock advisory, my pager starts going off. And I'm getting pages from the radio station. I'm getting pages from CBS News in New York. And so I went and I grabbed a phone on the wall when they used to have those things. And I called, and they said they shifted it. The forecast track had shifted from Pensacola to New Orleans in 1 3-hour period between those two forecast tracks. So now suddenly this monster in the Gulf was our storm. And it was Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And back then, people checked out on Friday afternoons, and there was no way to tell them what was going on unless they chose to watch the evening news, unless they chose to turn on a radio. There wasn't a whole lot of internet news back then. And, a lot of people didn't get the Saturday paper. They get the Sunday paper, and they look forward to the Sunday paper and reading it. So maybe the Saturday paper is just sitting on the lawn still Saturday morning. So our big challenge was, how do we tell people that all of a sudden this is no longer a Florida storm? It's coming to New Orleans, and it's the monster we've always feared. And everyone kicked into high gear with continuous coverage and trying to get the word out. And that was the challenge before. After Hurricane Katrina, it was even more challenging because the people who had stayed, no one had electricity. So watching television was not an option. There was water everywhere. There was no throwing newspapers in people's yards. So when it came down to it, unless you had a transistor radio or a car radio, you could not get information then. And we took that responsibility very seriously in radio and knew that we had no choice but to stay on the air. And it ended up that WWL signal was broadcast over every single radio station in New Orleans. Even the stations that were not affiliated with us, that were not in the same ownership group, they turned our signal on and they evacuated. So we felt that intense responsibility to then make sure we were giving everybody the information, even the evacuees. You couldn't listen to internet or watch internet news back then. It just was very, very limited then. And so at night, we know that people across the country were going to their cars, where you can hear us in 42 states at night, to find out what was happening at home.
Right, and it really was a challenge, of course, as you said, for print media and also for broadcast media to get the word out. But they did it. Those newsrooms did do it.
Oh, everyone kept doing it and kept working.
Right. So you know what?
It was more than a.
Go ahead, Mark,
It was
real quick.
more than a challenge. It was more than a challenge. We couldn't print
Right.
for 3 days. We were online, but the irony is that we created the internet newspaper that weekend. In that, for the next month, we had 8 million viewers a day for NOAA.com, for that new nascent startup. And that's how people were getting news from outside the city, was looking at us.
That's 15 years ago this weekend. Just hard to believe, and pray God we never have a repeat of it. Another big story, Mike, was the police.
And I remember all of that so distinctly. I don't know what kind of chemistry adrenaline has on memory, but I could go on for hours. But I'll just start with, how it began. Our experience was after we assembled a crew that was going to stay behind and remain in the city, brave whatever came and get into those floodwaters. We took a delivery truck, we piled in the back, and we pulled off the interstate at the Walmart on Chapatoulas, where we saw all kinds of police, EMS, fire trucks, and we figured, all right, that's a good place to start. At least there's some, officials, emergency officials. And we went and talked to some officers who said, we have no radio communication. There's no command and control here. We have no orders. That was a little disconcerting. Then we stepped into the Walmart. That's when it got to be actually frightening, because we saw wall-to-wall looting of the entire Walmart. People with hand trucks, people were pulling pickup trucks to the back, hauling out, flat screen televisions. As if that wasn't bad enough, we then went to see, because we saw the parking lot full of, police cars. We saw some officers inside the store, went to them, and it, didn't take long to see that officers themselves were looting. And I went up to one officer who I actually knew, from covering the beat, and he said, hey, look around you. It's every man for himself. There's nothing we can do. And that, along with the account of my colleague, Brian Teveno, became one of the first stories that we put out. We scribbled the story on the back of a notebook. We found a landline with underground wires. We were able to call it into Baton Rouge. And that actually became an important story to kind of set the tone of the chaos, number one, and became one of the early entries in the timeline of our breaking news Pulitzer Prize, one of 2 Pulitzers that the Times-Picayune was awarded for coverage of Katrina.
That's right. And I mean, it just led to ongoing stories, also just uncovering of things as the months, the years went by. We're going to need to wrap this segment up quickly. Sure. So your final thoughts on that.
All right. But yeah, so let me just say that, all right, we've all heard about the Danziger Bridge, police, shootings and killings. That should not take away from some real heroism on the part of officers. And I'll just give you one real quick example. I knew a bunch of officers. I would actually try to get to the Harrah's, valet parking apron in the morning, where that was the police command post, and all the commanders would gather around and figure out what was going on. I hooked up with Timmy Bayard, who was at the time the chief of major narcotics, and they were just commandeering boats, he and his officers, to go rescue people. There was, FEMA had not quite arrived with the big pontoon boats, and I just jumped in some boats. We went on boat rescues. And, once again, these are narcotics officers who suddenly are donning life jackets, swimming through water, plucking people out of, apartments through flooded waters. So there was some remarkable heroism and a million other stories, both the good, the bad, and the ugly on behalf of NOPD. So it should not detract from, we know there were 250 desertions. Officers, later came back and were disciplined over that. But there were some officers who, stood their ground, went into that water, and did some really heroic things.
Indeed there were, Mike. Thanks a lot. Errol, political response.
Well, there were 3 officials I wanted to look at in particular, the 3 executives, the mayor, the governor, and the president. The mayor was Ray Nagin at the time. And, Nagin had run for office, and when he caused some excitement when he got elected. He was not from politics. He was from business. He was this young guy. He was going to be a techno mayor. He was going to get the whole city Wi-Fi, and he was going to be a reform mayor. And I think he went in with all those ideals. Katrina wasn't what he bargained for. And all of a sudden, this was on his lap. And then the remainder of his term, he would have a tough time. This was more than any mayor could deal with. And then he got his own legal problems. But I got to say, that Saturday night, and first of all, the night before that, there'd been an event at the Roosevelt Hotel. And I saw Nagin, and I said, Mr. Mayor, how's everything going with the city? Things are going great. He says, the people from the Trump Tower just came in. There's going to be a Trump office building here. We're finalizing the federal building on the West Bank. Things are really on the move. So he was really excited. The next day he was hearing about what was happening. That Saturday night, during the 10 p.m. news block on the commercial TV stations, Nagin went to every station and told people something no mayor ever wants to say. No mayor ever wants to go on television and tell his people to get out of town. But he did that, and he was very, very passionate about it. He says, it's terrible. It's heading right to us. You know, we're not going to escape this. Get out of town. And he went to every station. I think that was maybe his finest moment. That was his Paul Revere moment. There'd be many bad moments to follow, but that was a good moment. Kathleen Blanco was governor, and I think Kathleen Blanco was a very decent woman, and she was elected governor with very high ideals, especially in education. Here again was something she didn't bargain for. And she wound up having a lot of conflict with the federal government, with the Bush administration. There was a big argument about sending in the National Guard. And the Bush administration wanted to federalize the National Guard. And apparently there's a real difference if you federalize it or if you do it under state command. It governs what type of laws that they're dealing with. And so there was a good bit of argument. The governor of Mississippi got the same thing, too. They didn't want their National Guard federalized. So there were all of those kind of things. There were delays. There were delays with the Federal Red Cross. And so Blanco got a rap of really just taking too long for anything to happen. Now, things like the Road Home program ultimately came, but it was just, some people just say it was just, I don't know, if was it politics, was it Republican versus Democratic politics, I don't know. But she really kind of got hurt with that. And then the other person was George Bush.
And we have to, real quick.
Okay, he was president at the time, he was in Texas. He heard about it, he had to fly back to Washington. And while he was flying back to Washington, he allowed this picture to be taken, which I think was with the best of intentions. This is from Air Force One, president looking down at the devastation. And I think he was trying to show passion and concern. It backfired tremendously. He even admitted it looked condescending. It looked like, he's too good to come on down. And that photo right there, a lot of people say, was really the turning point toward the negative in his administration. Ultimately, the federal government did a lot, but it took a while before it got started.
Okay, E, just all of those memories flooding on back. Mark, let's move back to the present now. When we just saw these two storms in the Gulf, Laura turning into a major hurricane. How protected are we now?
Well, we are better protected than ever have been, and probably the most protected city in the United States from hurricanes and storm surge. The problem is that our protection system, this huge modern levee system, which is well built, is designed to protect our property and not us. And that's something to remember. But in addition to that, the Corps of Engineers itself that designed and built it recognizes that the system as completed is at high risk. And the reason it's at high risk is because it's designed to a 1% standard, that 100-year storm. Mm-hmm. Well, here we had Laura. Laura's got to be a 300, 400-year storm. So the storm surge, that 20 feet of storm surge that Laura was supposed to have created, if that were to have happened in the New Orleans area, it would have overtopped levees here. Now, the good thing is that the levees would not have disappeared this time because they're properly built, so it would have reduced the flooding, but it would have been significant. So that's the thing that we need to remember. The Corps is about to embark on a program to upgrade those levees over the next 50 years, but it's still going to be at that 100-year level, while the localities are saying we need better, at least 200 years and maybe even higher.
And don't
Not to
forget,
mention
because
that
of
the levees
subsidence, I know
themselves are
you've done stories and I've
subsiding.
done stories.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, subsidence
Yeah.
has brought us, below the 100-year level, and they're now having to, upgrade those levees because of constant subsidence.
And then sea level rise is the extra challenge to it. Dave, you wanted to comment?
Yes, that's
Yeah, that's exactly
the
where I
sea
was
level
going,
rise
is that
actually.
they keep having to build up the tops of the levees because they keep sinking. And as the sea level comes up and the levees go down, then we're faced with a not as great protection as they were designed to have. The Corps assures us, however, they are staying ahead of that curve and they keep getting additional funding to keep bringing them back up, but it's a constant fight.
Well, now we
It
have the
will
big
be
pumps.
forever.
Yeah, well, we have those big pumps now at the end of the those outflow canals, and also the surge wall, the big wall, the lake-borne surge wall, $14 billion. But Mark, you said still we need to really be on guard and listen to what they tell us, right? In terms of
Absolutely.
evacuating. Okay, all right. Enduring memories of Katrina. Let's go around the table with that. Errol.
That Monday when Katrina finally made landfall through New Orleans, I'm in Marksville, Louisiana, central Louisiana. And at first it didn't look that bad. It knocked down some trees, some power lines. There was a fire at the 70 Yacht Club. But overall it didn't look that bad. And I think we're all thinking we'd be back home by Wednesday. That night I'm in the place where I was staying in Marksville, listening to radio, to WWL, and Dave Cohen comes on and says, the levees have just broken. And so I remember Dave making that announcement, and that was the moment when, like, our lives just turned right there.
They sure did. Dave, yours.
Well, that was one of mine, but I'll tell you a happy one. My 6-year-old at the time daughter called me and did not believe that I was still alive because she was seeing the coverage on television when she was with the rest of my family in Alexandria, Louisiana. She said, "Daddy, I know you can record your voice. You do it on the radio all the time." And so she wouldn't believe I was alive until she could see me. So my wife loaded all the kids up in the car. I got in the car from New Orleans and we met in Baton Rouge so I could prove to my daughter I had not drowned and died in Katrina.
Wow.
And that was one of the best moments of my life, was
bet.
being reunited with my family.
And your daughters, too, I'm sure, and your whole family for you. Mike.
Well, I can tell you that after 11 days of continuous coverage and 18-hour days, I finally peeled off to go visit my family. But my wife and 3 very, very young children made it to Milwaukee, and I got to go visit. I was so immersed in the coverage of the storm that we went to the shelter in Milwaukee that was sheltering New Orleans evacuees, and found people to interview. I did a story. I got a Dateline from Milwaukee. And just to wrap up, I found one person who was a witness to a murder that happened during the storm and was able to follow that story up.
Okay. Mark, real quick for you.
Sure. So the Saturday after the storm, I go to synagogue services in Baton Rouge, and we're sitting there at the end of services. I'm there sitting next to the rabbi from Gates of Prayer, and behind us I hear this commotion, and it's people walking in with Torahs, the prayer scrolls, and they're from my synagogue.
Right.
And what had happened was that Baton Rouge police had taken a truck down to remove them from our synagogue and bring them to safety in Baton Rouge.
Well, amazing memories, guys. Thanks so much for joining us to share that. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.